Hello everyone. So again, I'm Dr. Taryn Myers. I am the creator of this course and maybe the instructor of the course when you take it. And for this very brief lecture, I'm really just going to go over some terms that students often need clarification on. Since we don't have an in-person session for you to ask me these questions, I figured I'd just take a few minutes and go through these for you. So we'll start by doing chapter 1 of Feminist Psychology. So feminist psychology is sometimes just termed the psychology of women. So some of the organizations here are the Society for the Psychology of Women. There is an Association for Women in Psychology. It's a subfield of psychology that focuses on the lives and experiences of girls and women. And there are other subfields of psychology that also focus on men and masculinities and on LGBTQ plus issues. So those are also obviously relevant here. Feminism is really a movement to end sexism, sexist exploitation, and oppression. Really, honestly, the most basic definition of being a feminist is that you believe in the social, political, and economic equality between the sexes or among the sexes. That's it. So probably the vast majority of people are feminists and don't realize it or don't want to identify with that label. So when you take the psychology of women field and you look at it through the lens of feminism, that's what we call feminist psychology. So this is psychological research and theory that's explicitly informed by feminism. So one of the most important things we want to look at is oppression. So there are lots of different ways that unfortunately people can be oppressed. And one of the things we'll talk about a lot during this class, and I love that your book actually focuses on, is how these different types of oppression intersect. That's often called intersectionality, where you need to realize that two people, for example, who are the same gender might be differently oppressed based on something like disability status, for example. So oppression is the ways in which certain people experience degradation because of political, economic, or social realities. And then empowerment is the capacity to attain power. And we often think of empowerment sort of abstractly, the idea that you can empower yourself, but empowerment can also be concrete. Like you actually get power, you're elected to an office, you have a say in your government or your organization. So feminism has really changed over the years. And, you know, this is the timeline that we tend to look at. This is not to say that no one thought about women versus men before this, or that these were the only ways people were thinking at the time. It's just the way that a particular women's studies tends to look at this. So the first wave of feminism really focused on women's suffrage, which is trying to gain the right to vote. We didn't do that until 1920. And so I'm making this lecture in 2020. So it's only been 100 years that women in the US have the right to vote. So that's always helpful to keep in perspective. But it began in 1848 at the Seneca Falls Convention. One thing that's really notable here that's often sort of erased from first wave feminism is that there were women of color who were trying to be involved and who were calling for feminists to also endorse things like abolition. This is pre-Civil War, the Seneca Falls Convention. But the white privileged feminists wanted to focus only on one issue, and so they chose suffrage. Second wave feminism is what we typically think of when we think of the feminist movement. So this is the feminism of the 1960s, and it prioritized equitable access to the workforce, redefining women's roles, particularly in the home. And then a lot of people argue we are still in what they call third wave feminism, that began somewhere in the mid-90s. And the main focus is on intersectionality. So you'll hear me, again, talk a lot about intersectionality. My feminism is intersectional. That means that when you look at things like oppression or like any of the issues we'll talk about throughout the semester, you need to think about how does this affect different people differently. So yes, it affects women differently than men, and people who are non-binary differently than either of them. But what if, let's say, the woman is also poor, and is also homeless, and is also wheelchair bound, and is also a woman of color? and also identifies as queer, right? Now that person is experiencing even more difficulty than if they were, say, a white middle to upper class woman. And so some people have taken this to be in sort of different directions. This is why, as it says at the bottom, like waves isn't maybe the best metaphor. People have been active in between. The 80s were certainly a time where they focused on empowerment, but also that like not all feminism is the same within each of these waves. And that's really important to note. All right, so what is feminism? It's not just one thing. Not all feminists are the same. In fact, many feminists think in different ways, and there are 7 major feminist perspectives, or schools or theories. When I was in college and I took a class on feminist theory, this is actually how it was structured, is by looking at these types of perspectives. So one of the reasons I really like your book is that it frames looking at feminism in this way. So I'm going to go over each of these, just again, thumbnail sketch briefly, but to help us understand what do these actually mean. So the vast majority of people today in the US who identify as feminists would probably identify as liberal feminists. These are people who emphasize the similarities between men and women. Essentially, men and women can all do the same things. And then they really emphasize using government policies to eliminate barriers. So things like trying to get universal childcare or universal maternity leave, things like the Lilly Ledbetter Pay Fairness Act, things along those lines, the Violence Against Women Act. They're trying to eliminate structural inequalities or inequities. So the idea is if we can get rid of the structural level, government level, company level inequalities that are in place, it helps us move forward. And these folks really think that differences are due to your learned experience rather than innate biological differences. And, you know, a lot of psychology, particularly social psychology, lends itself to this. A lot of scientific research within the field supports this. Radical feminism is what people think of when they think of the stereotypes of a feminist, but even that isn't quite right. So it basically says that the fundamental form of oppression is this gender inequality, women's unjust treatment. It advocates for separatism, that women should somehow be separate than men in order to be equitable. They say that we need to move away from sort of our typical patriarchal, androcentric, male-centered way of thinking. And sort of a subtype of this is what's called lesbian feminism, and this focused on sexuality and reproduction as the central place of oppression, and talks about what they call compulsory heterosexuality. So the idea that our society just assumes everyone is heterosexual. Our whole way of thinking is framed around that. And we, in addition to just thinking that way, we also pressure people to be that way in a lot of problematic ways, even for people who are straight. Socialist feminism links gender oppression with capitalism, and is particularly this idea of the myth of meritocracy. This is the American dream, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Anyone can get there if you just try hard enough. No, if you are born into poverty, you have so many more barriers to overcome, right, than someone who is born with a trust fund. And so this really recognizes that we can't punish people who aren't there for the social inequities that have been placed on them by our society. So class, gender, and race influence our ability to accumulate wealth and the perceived value of what we do. Right? So sometimes this will be almost benevolent, like, wow, you do this really well for a woman, right? And sometimes it'll be like, oh, you just can't do that. Cultural feminism is one that kind of surprises people sometimes, but it argues that there is a problematic lack of value placed on unique experiences, perspectives, and qualities of women. It does endorse gender essentialism, says women and men are fundamentally different. Women have this ethic of care and kindness, and that we should value those things. It's sort of interesting to try to wrap your head around if you think of it sort of in contrast to modern liberal feminism, for example. A women of color feminism is sometimes called womanism, and they say that women's inequality and inequality is linked to racial inequities as well, and that these things intersect. And they really respond to feminism's ethnocentrism. So feminism, at least the visible forms of feminism, have often been run by white middle-class women. And the ideas of Black women or other women of color have often been erased. So for example, the Me Too movement. When that started to get popular, people were like, oh, this white woman came up with it. But in fact, several years earlier, it was actually a Black feminist who initially came up with the hashtag Me Too to talk about sexual harassment and sexual assault. Queer feminism looks at inequality being related to our constructions of women and man, how we study those things, how we use those to organize society. And it questions what is female, what is male. It critiques heteronormativity, this idea that everyone is supposed to be, again, heterosexual, the assumption that everyone's heterosexual, the lack of accommodation for people who are not. So for example, a lot of forms, even though we have marriage equality, right? A lot of forms will still say things like husband, wife, right? Instead of spouse, spouse. And so that becomes difficult if you are a same-sex couple. Sex, gender, and sexuality are not always aligned in a predictable way, they say. And more people are really not only realizing this, endorsing it, but acknowledging that this existed far before our modern time. So for example, Native Americans have always had essentially a third gender. They call it a two-spirited person who feels like they have both male and female aspects. And in fact, those people were often shamans or other religious figures and were given great respect. You will hear this term cisgender. If this is your first time taking a class like this, this might be a novel concept to you. Cisgender just means that your gender assigned at birth is the same as your gender identity. Okay, so a lot of us taking this course, that might be the case for us. Transgender is where your gender assigned at birth or your sex assigned at birth does not match with your gender identity. So cisgender is essentially the term to complement transgender, and it's okay if you don't know this term. I admittedly didn't even know this term myself until a few years ago. So the field is always growing, changing, and even those of us within it, this term has been around for a while, but I was just never exposed to it. So we're always learning, and that's an important part of feminist psychology, is being open to new expansions within the field. Post-colonial or transnational feminism connects inequality to the legacy of colonialism. Little screen cap of that is essentially, for a long time, there were these world powers like the United Kingdom, the United States, France, Portugal, right, that went out and conquered areas, right, and tried to get people to appropriate to their cultures, their languages often, right? So it critiques the belief as well that women in Western countries are the most liberated, right? We just see it that way, and that even though we see things in other cultures as oppressive, other women might not see them that way. Part of this is what's called third world feminism, which claims that feminism should address issues from multiple perspectives and not assume a unified position, that it should acknowledge that there may be different ways to address these things. I'll give you an example of this. So I am a member of the American Psychological Association. Now, as I'm filming this, we are in the midst of shelter in place for the COVID-19 crisis and pandemic. One of the things that unfortunately has happened because of that is an increase in domestic violence. So the American Psychological Association is actually working with psych organizations worldwide to address this issue, and they're recognizing that they need to address it differently in different cultures in order to be the most effective. This is a really common thing people say. I'm not a feminist, but so post-feminism is this idea that we're there already. We don't need any more feminist movement, women have gender equality already. We know that's not true, right? This is kind of like saying, like, we have no race problem because we had, a Black president. No, we do. We still have issues, right? And so some people will not identify as feminists because of that. Other people won't identify as feminists because of stereotypes against feminists, that they're man-haters or bra burners. And, sure, there are people within the feminist movement who may identify that way, but the vast majority of feminists, again, everyday people who just believe in equality. And this backlash can really discourage feminist identification. So who identifies as feminists? And this is actually something I've done research on. So I mentioned earlier, sort of people who identify as feminists versus acknowledge equality. In one large-scale study I did, I asked, do you identify as feminist? And do you believe in the socioeconomic and political equality of the genders? And only about 45% of people identified as feminists, but 95% of people agreed with the essential basic definition of feminism. So people just don't know the term, or, like we talked about on the previous slide, reject it. Things that are related to feminist identification: having feminist relatives, taking a course like this one, having a sexual minority identity, or if you've experienced overt feminism, sometimes that pushes you that way. I mentioned womanism before. There's also a specific type of feminism for Latinx women. And these women may not identify as feminists because of some of those ethnocentric biases we've talked about already. There are a lot of advantages to identifying as feminists. They are perceived as intelligent, knowledgeable, productive, career-oriented, and active. They develop relationships across different, so they are not just within their little bubble. They have better psychological well-being, less body shame, increased sexual satisfaction. So some of my own research has looked at feminist beliefs as a potential protective factor against body dissatisfaction, and what we find is it's sort of like a buffering. It doesn't perfectly make it go away, but it does protect a little bit at least. It also can be really healthy for men. And now some people argue that men can't be feminist, that they should instead identify as pro-feminist, that being a feminist requires you to be a woman. I personally argue that anyone, any gender, who wants to identify as feminist can identify as feminist. But for men, it allows them to reject the rigid norms of masculinity, particularly the subtype of masculinity that we often term toxic masculinity, and that can be really psychologically healthy for men to reject that. All right, so really quick history of feminism in psychology. So psychology only developed in the late 1800s as its own field, so it's a really relatively new science. So in the late 1800s, really even into the early 1900s, very few women studied psychology. Some who even were able to study psychology, do psychological research, still had to sneak in to men's meetings, either hiding under the table, or there was a great story about a woman who literally wore a fake mustache to get into a meeting. Sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. And their research focused on disputing this idea of biological determinism, that your sex organs determine your behavior. In the 1900s, women became more diverse. So Mamie Phipps Clark is a social psychologist who, along with her husband Kenneth Clark, conducted research using dolls. They had African-American girls look at Black dolls and white dolls and say comments about them or point to which one represented which, and they said, all the positives were associated with the white doll, all the negatives were associated with the Black doll. And this was actually used as part of a brief to the Supreme Court in the Brown versus Board of Education decision, and it helped them determine that segregated / separate but equal schools were not actually equal and were psychologically damaging to these children. And then in the mid-1900s, really the 60s, 70s, the psychology of women emerged as its own field. And feminist psychologists fought against sexist research and clinical procedures. And really, to be honest, we still have to do this to this day. For a long time, there's been sort of this joke, but not really, in psychology that, and there's actually a great book by this title called Even the Rat Was White, right? Even the rat was white and male. For a long time, we didn't do research on any type of female animal, woman, and we found a lot of different things once we started doing that. Amazing. So one basic example is we used to only think there was like the fight or flight response, right? When they started studying female animals, what they discovered is there's also tend, where when you're in a life or death situation, you may tend to your offspring or other vulnerable people or animals before yourself. And there's also befriend, where you build up a social network, so you have that to lean on. So this is the scientific method within psychology, and this is how we do the psychology of women, feminist psychology. Psychology is a science, and so we approach any research question we address doing this method. So we come up with a theory, or we have a theory that we look at, and that's a proposed explanation for why certain things occur. And then we come up with a testable prediction, which we call a hypothesis based on that. A very specific thing that we can test in a very specific way. And when you all do your research proposal project for this class, you'll be asked to come up with hypotheses. Then you have to operationalize your variables. How are you going to measure something like feminism? Well, you could just ask, are you a feminist or not? Right? You ask people to rate themselves on a Likert scale, or there are lengthier questionnaires about feminist beliefs. You find a sample and collect data. Who's that sample going to be? Is it going to be college women? Is it going to be women and men? Is it going to be people on Facebook, people in certain groups, right? Who's it going to be? Then you do statistical analyses, you determine your results, you write everything up, and you share your findings. And this is peer-reviewed academic journals, but you can do it other ways as well, such as at conferences, popular press books, etc. All right, so that is it for our initial mini lecture term coverage. I don't really have a good term for this, for chapter 1. I hope this was helpful for you and not too redundant, and I will see you in the one for chapter 2.